Now, I want to add to this that these errors involved in statism general, that is in the idea that we need a state in order to protect our lives and our property, there are additional errors involved when it comes to the idea of a democratic state in particular. The traditional, pre-modern form of a state is that of an absolute monarchy. But monarchies were faulted because, especially also by classical liberals, because they said monarchies rest on privileges. The king has privileges as compared with regular subjects. Monarchies are incompatible with the idea of equality before the law of all people. Now, what they proposed then, the democratic opponents of monarchical states, was we have to open entry into the state to everyone, and that allegedly makes everyone equal before the law. Everyone can now become the king, so to speak. However, this democratic equality, everyone can potentially become the king, is something entirely different from the idea of a universal law that applies to all people in the same way. The objectionable dualism between a higher law of the kings and a lower law, so to speak, of regular people exists under democratic conditions just as before. The only difference is that the privileges are no longer personal privileges, privileges of the noble class or of the king, but they are functional privileges. That is, there is in democracies a difference between what we call private law, which is the law that covers the relationship between private citizens, and public law that protects public officials and regulates what public officials can do. There exists a difference between private law and public law is, so to speak, superior over private law. Under democracy, if you are a functionary, if you are a public official, you can do things that as a private citizen you would not be allowed to do. Just as a king could do something that private people could not do. As a private person, I cannot take your money out of your wallet is considered to be stealing. On the other hand, if I do it as a public official, then it is called taxation. If as a private person I steal money from you and then do something beneficial to somebody else, I give it to the person next to me, this would be called stealing and fencing of stolen goods. If you do that as a public official, then it is called social policy. If I take you, kidnap you, force you to work for me, as a private citizen, this would be considered enslavement and I would be punished for it. On the other hand, if I'm a public official, I take you, enslave you, serve in the army for 2 years or something like this, then that is called public, I'm compelling you to do public service. So you realize this difference between two types of laws exists under democracy just as much as it existed under monarchy. But things are even worse than this. Because look at what takes place when we replace kings with democratic rulers. The king considered the country, so to speak, as his private property. He could sell it off, he could pass it off in the form of inheritance to the next generation and so forth. Under democracy, you replace somebody who considers the country his personal property with somebody who is a caretaker, a temporary caretaker for a certain period of time of the country. He cannot sell the country and keep the money himself, but he can make use of the country during the time that he is in charge. Now, does that make a difference? The answer is, it makes a tremendous difference. Imagine I give you a house and tell you you are the owner of the house. You can sell it, you can see what happens to the market value of the house if you do this to the house or that to the house. You can pass it on in the form of an inheritance. Then you will, by and large, tend to preserve the value of the property. On the other hand, I tell you, the same house, you don't own it, you cannot sell it, you cannot pass it on as a form of an inheritance to somebody else, but for 4 years, 8 years, you can use it as you see and try to make as much money out of it as you can do. Now, what you will do is, of course, you will engage in capital consumption. That is, even if the house is afterwards a ruin, but you had 4 glorious years where you could make all sorts of income from using this house. So the difference between a king and the democratic caretakers, the kings by and large have a long-run perspective and by and large tend to preserve the value of their property because it is regarded as their property. Democratic rulers try to rob the country as quick as possible because they know after 4 or 8 years they might have no chance to do so anymore. So now I come to what then is the solution to the problem of social order and the enforcement of social order. The states are disasters in this regard for reasons that I explained. The solution is what I call a private law society. What is a private law society? A private law society is a society where every individual institution is subject to one and the same rules, the rules that I explained at the very beginning. There exists no public law that grants privileges to anyone, to any particular person, or to any specific functions that people perform. No one is permitted to acquire property by any other means than through original appropriation, through production, or through voluntary exchange. Nobody has the right to expropriate anyone. No one has the right to tax anyone. No one can prevent anyone else to enter with his own resources any line of production of goods or services that he might want to enter. That is, there exist no monopolies of any kind. And specifically to the problem that we have at hand, in a private law society, the production of security, that is, of making sure that nobody breaks laws and that those people who do break laws are caught, punished, and so forth. This is also done by freely financed individual firms, by freely financed police agencies, insurance agencies, and arbitration agencies. Now, it would be somewhat presumptuous to try to predict exactly what the outcome of this will be, but we can predict certain fundamental structural features of such a society. First off, while in a complex society based on division of labor, self-defense will only play a secondary role, and I'll explain that later why. It should be clear from the outset that in a private law society, everyone's right to engage in self-defense is sacrosanct. That is, nobody disputes the right of people to engage in self-defense. In distinct contrast to the present situation, that is, to the present statist situation with which we are, of course, all familiar, which renders people increasingly unarmed and defenseless against aggressors. In a private law society, no restrictions on private ownership of firearms and other weapons would exist. Everyone's elementary right to engage in self-defense, to protect his life and property against invaders would be holy, so to speak. And we do know from the Wild West, which was not as wild as it is depicted in Wild West movies, that the right of people to bear arms is enormously powerful. In the Wild West, it did not occur very frequently, hardly ever, that anyone tried to rob a bank. Because if you tried to rob a bank, in almost all cases you were dead before you walked out of the bank, because all bank tellers were armed, and the chance to get out of this was almost non-existent. There exists an abundance of literature on this, how safe societies are in which people are allowed to own guns. There's a book by American economist John Lott with the title More Guns, Less Crime, and he gives ample empirical illustration for this statement. The more guns are in private hands, the less crime there is. Switzerland, for instance, is a country that is heavily armed. All Swiss males have semi-machine guns at home with ammunition, and the crime rate in Switzerland is lower than in almost any other country that I'm aware of. Now, but just as in today's complex society, we do not produce our own shoes or telephones, or cars, but rely on division of labor. In a private law society, by and large, when it comes to the production of security, we would also rely on specialized producers and by no means rely exclusively on self-defense. Most security services will, in a private law society, then provided by specialized agencies competing for voluntarily paying clients by various police, arbitration, and insurance companies. Now, if you wanted to summarize in one word what the decisive difference and advantage of a competitive security industry would be, as compared to the present statist way of providing security, if we wanted to characterize in one word what the difference would be, then this one word would be contract. The state, with which we are all familiar, as the ultimate decision maker and judge, operates, as you all know, in some sort of contractless legal vacuum. There exists no contract between the state and its citizens. It is not contractually fixed what is actually owned by whom, and what accordingly needs to be protected is also not fixed. It is not fixed what service the state is to provide, what is to happen if we are dissatisfied with what the state does, and it is not fixed what the price is that we must pay for this alleged service that the state provides, protecting our lives and our property. Nor is it fixed what happens if we come to the conclusion, look, you guys didn't do what you said you would do, what now? Now imagine something like this. Imagine there would be a private agency that would offer protection services to you, and they would just say something like this.